Reparations Conversations 2021 are sponsored by New Covenant Fellowship, the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation, and the Interfaith Alliance of Champaign County. Our first conversation on April 25th begins by examining how nations attempt repair, focusing on the U.S. Civil War, German reparations, Japanese compensation to POWs, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa following apartheid. Pastor Renee Antrosio hosts as Dr. Paul Finkelman, president of Gratz College in Greater Philadelphia, shares his expertise in civil rights law and history. Welcome to the conversation.
It's an honor to be here. And this is a very, very important topic. And I can see many of you in your pictures. I love to see people when I'm talking to them because I get a sense that I'm actually connected to people rather than to simply names on screens. So if you don't mind, show your video face. If not, thank you, Jan. I see, just came on because it humanizes this. This is going to be a conversation and a talk, and I am happy to have people who send me chats or raise your hand. There's a raise your hand possibility in Zoom, and I'm happy to see you raise your hand, and I can even call on you, and perhaps Renee can unmute you, and so we can have a conversation. There are not a huge number of people here, so this should be more like a conversation than a formal lecture. And I think that's really the way to begin. So let me start with the issue of what reparations are and what reparations are not, because I think it's very important for people to understand these concepts. I looked up in the dictionary online, of course, because everything's online, and I said, definition of reparations. And the definition that comes out, which makes sense, is the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. One way of thinking about reparations, of course, is that reparations comes from the concept of repair. That is, it is to repair a wrong. And in this sense, reparations is different from a compensation. It is also different from a return of something that you have taken away from somebody else. And so when we think about the problem of reparations, we begin to think about the fact that there are many different mixed up and sometimes similar and sometimes not similar notions of what reparations is. I want to start not with reparations, but with the American Civil War, because for Americans, the main huge reparations issue concerns American slavery. And so we have to start by understanding what American slavery was, what the American Civil War was, and what happened after that. From there, I want to move, weirdly perhaps for some of you, to World War I, because I want to talk a very bit about reparations after World War I. And then I want to move further to World War II and talk about post-war reparations. That is probably going to take up our whole day because Renee, you can nod on this, but we're supposed to end at about 7:15 your time, correct? And I want to have lots of questions and I want to have interaction. This should be a conversation. It should not be the professor pontificating and telling you the truth, because I don't want to do that. I want to have a conversation. I want to share with you knowledge that I have, but then I want to share with you your thoughts and your notions and your ideas. Having said I'm going to start with the Civil War, I first want to say something about myself, because I think it's important to know where I am coming from. I did a PhD in U.S. history under the great African-American historian John Hope Franklin, who was arguably the most important academic of the last half century of the 20th century and lived on into the 21st century. To list all of his firsts would take hours and hours and hours. The most important thing, I think, for our understanding is that he is the author of a book, From Slavery to Freedom, which made it possible to teach African American history across colleges and universities and in many high schools because he provided a text that worked. It's now in its 8th or 9th edition. It's one of the very few history books I know that has been in print for some 60 years, which is truly remarkable. Actually, it's been in print for 70 years. Most of my work has been on slavery and race relations, and often the interconnection between slavery, race relations, and law. I am currently the president of Gratz College in Greater Philadelphia, and Gratz College has the unique position of being the oldest independent Jewish college in the United States. It was never a seminary. It never educated people to be rabbis. It was rather a college which taught Hebrew, it taught Jewish studies, and has morphed over the years into being a college which focuses on human rights and human dignity. Under my presidency, the one thing I can brag about is that I have created a Center for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights, where we study Holocaust and genocide. And it's important to understand that the Holocaust is simply one of many genocides that have taken place in the world. Our students study Rwanda, they study the former Yugoslavia, they study Armenia, they study the Irish famine, they study Native Americans, they study the Holocaust. But in that center, it is a center for Holocaust studies and human rights, because human rights is connected to all of this. So I come at this topic with a deep personal sense of the importance of these subjects and the importance of repair, because at its heart, reparations is about how you repair a society. What does it take to repair a society, and what does it take to repair individuals? So let me lay that out. Now let me switch to the American Civil War. It's important for everybody to understand that the cause of the American Civil War was slavery. Every southern state seceded because the southern states feared that the new Lincoln administration was going to harm slavery in some way. A number of them passed resolutions saying we are seceding because a president has been elected who believes that slavery should be put on the road of ultimate extinction, which is what Lincoln had said. And they're very explicit about that. If you learned in high school or learned in college that it was about states' rights, that's simply poppycock. That's something that Southerners invented after the Civil War to justify why they helped slaughter 635 or 650,000 Americans, why they destroyed their own economies and their own societies. They couldn't say, oh, well, we did it because we wanted to hold people in slavery, so they said it was about states' rights. If you read the secession documents, the only time they mention states' rights is to complain when northern states are using their rights to protect runaway slaves, or when northern states are using their states' rights to end slavery in northern states. It's not about states' rights, nor is it about a national, a northern industrial economy oppressing a southern agrarian economy. First of all, in 1860, the northern economies and the southern economies were very similar. Most Southerners were farmers, just like most Northerners. If you look at Illinois, there are as many people living in rural areas in Illinois in 1860 as there are Mississippi. It's a farm world. Until 1900, more than half of all Americans lived on farms, and most of the rest lived in very small towns and villages. We were not an urban industrial society, and in fact, the United States Industrial Revolution does not happen until after the Civil War. When we think of the great steel factories in Pittsburgh, well, there aren't steel factories in Pittsburgh in 1860. because nobody's producing steel, because nobody's invented the Bessemer converter yet, to give you one example of this. But many of us have been fed a myth about this. And we've been fed a myth because Americans do not want to come to terms with slavery. Southerners don't want to come to terms with the fact that they seceded to protect slavery. They don't want to come to terms with the fact that their ancestors were traitors to the country that they were a part of. I once, in a lecture, to show you how brave I am, and it's easy to talk about this in Champaign, Illinois, you know. I gave a lecture at the University of Texas where I referred to Robert E. Lee as a traitor. And afterwards, this student came storming down to the front of the room. He was about 6'14". I mean, he was like the biggest kid I'd ever seen, who wasn't a football player. He had a shaved head, and I looked at him, and he was so angry. He was like, he couldn't even speak straight. And I said, "You look like you might be in the military." He said to me, he started by saying, "How could you call Robert E. Lee a traitor?" And I said, "You look like you might be in the military." And he rattled off in like 2 seconds, "Yes, sir, I'm in the Marine Platoon Leaders Corps, sir." And I said, "Well, what's the oath that you took when you entered the Corps?" And he rattled it off. And I said, "Well, you know, that's substantially the same oath Robert E. Lee took when he entered West Point. If somebody in your unit put on a different uniform and started shooting at you, what would you call it?" And it was like, you know, when you hit a mirror with a pebble and the glass begins to crack. His face sort of, he was dumbfounded. And finally he said, "Well, couldn't you think of another word for it?" And I said, "No, I can't. There isn't another word for it." And that leads to why was this treason going on? It was going on to protect slavery. The Vice President of the Confederate States said that the cornerstone of the Confederacy, the cornerstone was two things. It was slavery, and it was the belief that Black people were inherently inferior to white people. It was the belief that white people should always be on top and Black people should always be inferior. And so when we understand what the Civil War was about, when we understand what the Confederacy was about, it was about racism. It was the first apartheid country. It was the first Nazi country. It was a country predicated on the notion that one group of people should forever and ever and ever oppress another group of people. So we fight the Civil War. Now, some of you may say, well, wait a minute. Lincoln said he was fighting to preserve the Union. He was, and here's why. Because the U.S. Constitution protected slavery every time you turned around. There was slavery everywhere in the U.S. Constitution. By the way, if any of you want like further reading on any of this, I'm going to give you my email address. It's paul.finkelman@yahoo.com. paul.finkelman@yahoo.com. You can email me. I'm happy to send you stuff to read if you want to read about some of this, if you have questions that you don't get answered here. So in this context, Lincoln said, I'm fighting this war to preserve the Union. In a famous letter, he said, I would preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves. I would preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves. I would preserve the Union by freeing some and not freeing others. And people always point to this and say, see, he didn't care about slavery. But what people forget is that when Lincoln wrote this letter, he'd already written the Emancipation Proclamation. He had already authorized the enlistment of Black troops. He was simply waiting for the right moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So when he says, I would end this war by preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, that was nonsense. By then, more than 100,000 slaves had been freed by the U.S. Army. Many of them were working for the Army. And at that time, there were 3 regiments of former slaves in South Carolina that were being trained to fight for the end of slavery. So that's what the war is about. But because the Constitution protected slavery, and because slavery was a form of property, and the Constitution says you cannot take private property without just compensation, Weirdly, the first time the U.S. ends slavery, which is in the District of Columbia, Congress gives compensation to all the slave owners. So slave owners get $300 for every slave they own. Why? Because under the law, they're property, and it's cheaper to give $300 to every slave owner in Washington, D.C. than it is to litigate and fight it out. It's cheaper to get it done that way. Now, is it moral to get it done that way? That's a different question. But morality and practicality are often not the same thing. So when we think about the ending of slavery, the ending of slavery is the largest destruction of private property in the history of the United States. Because while Congress compensates the District of Columbia slave owners in the spring of 1862, in the fall of 1862, Lincoln says, all slaves in the Confederacy will be free on January 1st. No compensation. This is the cost of fighting a war. We are going to take your property away from you. We're going to take your slaves away from you. And when the war is winding down, Congress passes the 13th Amendment, which says that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the United States. And that is the end of slavery. And you can take property away without compensation if you're doing it in a constitutional amendment. And in the 14th Amendment, and I just want to read this so everybody hears it. In the 14th Amendment, passed in 1866, a year after the war, ratified in 1868, it says that there shall be no claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So what we do in the Constitution is first abolish slavery and then say, by the way, in case you didn't get it, you can't come to the U.S. and demand compensation because we took your slave away. Slavery is over. So that is the ending of the Civil War. Now, the problem is the slave owners have lost their property. $2 billion worth of property has ceased to exist. That property is now owned by the individual former slaves. But what do the slaves get? What do they get for uncompensated work? What do they get for all of the wealth they had helped accumulate in the antebellum South? And the answer is not much. The answer is Congress creates a Freedmen's Bureau, which helps slaves adjust to freedom. Congress, with the help of the federal government and with many, many volunteer organizations from the North, creates schools all over the South. Colleges are created for the first time in the South for Black people. But no one puts on the table the notion that there should be a compensation for the labor that slaves gave to their masters. There is some talk about giving land to former slaves, and some former slaves get land. But there is never a program of 40 acres and a mule that some anti-slavery people and some generals and some Black leaders said former slaves should be entitled to. It's never put on the table. Now, I want to hold all this. I want to take this story and put it aside for a minute and move forward. But before I do, I want to take any questions. If somebody has a question, raise your hand, or Renee could unmute you and you could ask the question. But I'm not seeing any hands go up, so I guess I get to keep talking. I was hoping I could take a sip of tea first, so I will.
Dr. Finkelman?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm a guest of Pastor Renee and Reverend Terrence Thomas of Bethel AME Champaign, Fisk graduate. I'm very familiar with Dr. Hope Franklin's work. If you, not to take over your presentation, but if you will, can you give some context to the struggles that happened during this time? Because there are distinct camps around the reparation issues. Sherman's field order, for example, the radical Republicans, and the constant bickering between them and Lincoln, and then the Johnson administration.
Right.
Because I think that helps frame the argument, because there is this space where Black people are given some autonomy and grace and freedom, but that's slowly rolled back on the federal level to appease Southern landowners and those who are returning. But I don't want to take your presentation. I just would like for you, if you have time, to unpack that a little bit.
All right. So your question, I'm supposed to speak today and then 2 more times, right? And your question could hijack all of that time because it is the big question. But let me try to
do it when it comes time for me, I don't have to do it. So that's why.
Okay. But let me try to give you what I hope will be the 5-minute answer, because I do want to move on to some other things. So one of the problems of the United States in 1865, as the war ends, is that no country in the world has ever dealt with what the United States is dealing with. There have not been geographic civil wars in other countries. For instance, England famously had the English Civil War in the 1640s and 1650s. But it was not a geographic civil war. It was not Northern England against Southern England. It was neighbors against neighbors. So there wasn't a notion of a geographic component to civil war. Nor had most countries faced the kind of incredible bloodletting of the American Civil War. The best guess is that 650,000 Americans, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly relatively young, between ages 14 and 30, die in the war or die immediately after the war. There are some people who say it's 750,000, but what they're doing is including people who died 20 years later from war wounds. I think that's a different issue. But if you think about it, in 1860, the United States has more or less 30 million people. Today, the United States is closer to 350 million people. That is to say, we are 10 times the size of the United States at the Civil War, or 11 times. So if we take that 650,000 figure and multiply it by 10, it would mean that if the United States were to fight the Civil War today, 6.5 million people would die in the war. It's hard to imagine that kind of death toll in a 4-year period in any country. It is an enormous death toll. And particularly it's a death toll that is faced by a particular select group of the society. So not only are 650,000 men dying, but 650,000 women may never get married. 650,000 or more, or children will never see their fathers again. Spouses will never see their husbands again. It is a traumatic, horrendous social issue, the war. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Northerners who fight the war and win the war, and who are in favor of getting rid of slavery, never imagine what the South will do to resist the result of the war. Northerners simply cannot comprehend white terrorism. They cannot comprehend terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerging out of the Civil War, murdering people, torturing people, raping people, burning people's houses, shooting people. Nor can they imagine the unbelievably murderous viciousness of Southern whites. It's estimated in 1865 and 66, from the end of the war in April until, say, the following April, it's estimated that every day in Mississippi, 2 Black people were murdered. Nobody's being charged for these murders. The military commander in Texas, George Armstrong Custer, writes back that hundreds of Blacks are simply shot down in the South, and no white people are arrested, even though these murders are taking place in broad daylight. The Congress spends 3 months investigating what's going on in the South, issues a report which is literally this thick. It's 800 pages. The report on the Joint Committee of the report of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, detailing the atrocities that are going on all over the South. This is what leads to the 14th Amendment. It leads to the Civil Rights Act. But the tragedy is, while this is going on, as we know, Lincoln has been assassinated. He has been replaced by a former slave owner from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who is a virulent racist, who despises the notion of Black equality. Johnson doesn't have any problem with ending slavery. Even though he owned slaves, he hated the rich planters, so he didn't mind taking their slaves in them. But he doesn't believe in Black suffrage. He doesn't believe in Black education. He doesn't believe in Black land ownership. He doesn't believe in anything other than changing the status of African Americans from human property owned by people to non-property. But he doesn't see them getting any kind of equality. There are some things he's fine with. He's, for instance, okay with the idea that former slaves can marry, and that because one of the great tragedies of slavery was always that masters could separate families. They could sell a wife or a husband away. Can't do that after slavery. But otherwise, he really doesn't care what happens to Black people. And Johnson encourages the rise of terrorism in the South. When U.S. Army generals try to suppress the Klan, Johnson replaces them with other generals who are less likely to suppress the Klan. So we have a 3.5-year period from the murder of Lincoln until when Grant becomes president in March 1869. It's almost a 4-year period, really, when the United States is ruled by a deeply racist president. Now, I use the term racist in the context of the times. Racism is, after all, a changing concept. But by the standards of the world that Andrew Johnson lived in, he is pretty far out there on the extreme of hating Black people, despising Black people, not wanting them to succeed. So when General Sherman says, we should give this land to Black people, and he says, start distributing land that is abandoned by their owners, Johnson will have none of it. And Congress spends 4 years passing laws which Johnson vetoes, and then Johnson's vetoes are overridden by Congress. It is a disaster of monumental proportions, and it's a disaster that we are still living with today. Reverend, I hope that helps answer your question.
It does. Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it, Doctor.
Okay, and that, by the way, if you think about it, when we think about what might have been done in 1865 or 66, it can't be done because, as we all know, even though presidents are not dictators, although sometimes they would like to be, presidents can obstruct Congress, presidents can obstruct progress, presidents can have enormous power to prevent change from taking place. And that is what is going on from 1865 until 1869. There was another question.
So let's get to Pastor Janet and then Professor Julian. Pastor Janet, you had a question?
Okay.
Well, it's Mark.
Actually,
Mark,
it's
go
me,
ahead.
Mark. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Finkelman. I wanted to ask, has anyone ever done an estimate of the monetary value of slave labor up to 1865, and then as a postscript, the value of convict leasing programs thereafter, which is the loophole in the 13th Amendment, of course.
Okay. All right. Okay. So a couple of things. How do you quantify things from a long time ago? And when you think about American slavery begins in the 1660s. There are African Americans, mostly in Virginia before the 1660s, a few in Maryland, a few in, by the way, in Dutch New York. But there is no slave system that's created until Virginia begins to do so in the 1660s. And well into the 1680s, there are probably more free blacks in Virginia than there are people who are held as slaves. But by 1720, Virginia is completely committed to slavery. So it would be extremely difficult, impossible, I think, to have any understanding of how much wealth slaves produced from, say, 1660 to 1860. That's a hell of a long time. Can I say that in front of pastors? I'm surrounded by ministers here. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'm precluded from saying, but it's a long time. In addition, I watch a lot of reparations videos. I listen to reparations. I read a lot, and people throw out numbers. But if you were to give this problem to a team of economists, and let's suppose they were not, right-wing Wall Street economists, but they were economists who really cared about the issue. The economists would say, the first thing you have to do is figure out how much did the slaves get, as well as how much did they produce. So two economists in the 1970s, one of whom, Robert Fogel, won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and Stanley Engerman, who is at University of Rochester, and Stan is a very good friend of mine, and I knew Fogel when I was a graduate student at Chicago, although not well. They did a study of slaves in the last 25 years before the Civil War, called Time on the Cross. They put all the data they could find into computers, they churned it up, they analyzed it. They came to the conclusion that slaves received about 90% of the wealth that they produced. Now, we could argue about that. There were critics of Fogel and Engerman said, no, that's too much. They only got 80% or 70%. But whatever number you figure, you have to figure out, well, if we're really going to do a reparation, or if we're really going to do a compensation, because what you're going to is really a compensation. If you're really going to do a compensation, you have to balance the compensation on both sides of the balance sheet. Obviously, slaves got food, they got clothing, they got housing. Some of them got some education. Some of them got some skills training. How much is that worth versus how much is the wealth they produced? By the way, when you ask how much is the wealth they produced, you also have to ask the question, how much is the value of the children they produced? Because owning slaves, as I tell my students, owning slaves for Southerners was like having a stock that's both an income stock and a growth stock, because it produces income, but the slaves also produce children, which produce growth and more wealth. So all of this is really very, very complicated. I would not begin to try and figure this out, okay? The other piece of this, and this goes to the issue of reparations, is that there is a difference. And I want to talk about this. And by the way, I would much rather ask questions and give a prepared talk. But at some point, I have to give a little bit of the prepared talk, so I cover some of the things I want to say. So I love these questions. So there is a difference, for example, between compensation and reparation. Reparation is to repair what you owe somebody for the harm you gave them. I'll give you an example. The Japanese captured many American soldiers, particularly airmen that were shot down during World War II. They put them in POW camps, which they were supposed to do under the Geneva Convention. And then they sent them to work in factories, or they set up factories in the POW camps. The Nazis, of course, did the same thing all over Europe. They took captured prisoners, particularly Soviet prisoners, and they sent them to work. And now, making prisoners work is a violation of the Geneva Convention. It's a violation of the rules of law that both Japan and Germany had signed before World War II. About 15 years ago, a group of surviving U.S. POWs from Japan sued the Japanese government, not for reparations, not for compensation for being mistreated, but rather they said, we are suing you for back wages because you made us work in factories, you made us work in industries. You know, we were putting in 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is what you owe us. Now, the Japanese government, and by the way, I have taught in Japan 4 or 5 times. I love Japan. I visit it whenever I get a chance to do so. There are many things about Japanese culture that I adore. But one of the things about Japanese culture that I cannot stand is the fact that Japan as a nation does not know the words, I'm sorry. That Japan does not know the words, we were wrong. And so Japan has never admitted to doing anything wrong. But when sued for back wages, Japan said, you know, you're right. You're entitled to back wages. And here's what the wages were for laborers in Japan at that time. We're going to calculate all the wages. We're going to give you interest, and here's a sum of money. But they wouldn't say it was wrong for us to make you work. They simply said there is a compensation due. So one of the things to think about when we think about reparations is, of course, the difference between a compensation and a reparation. A compensation is what somebody owes you for not paying you for what they did. A reparation is what someone gives you to essentially say, I did you wrong. And nothing can compensate you for what I did wrong to you. Nothing can ever compensate you. But a reparation is a statement of fault, a statement of bad behavior. Let me give you one more example of this, because it's salient to all that we are talking about. In 1951, Germany offered to pay Israel a substantial sum of money, ultimately about $1 billion, including $3,000. And in those days, by the way, $3,000 was a lot of money. And you could buy a car for a couple $100 bucks. The annual salary of a worker in the U.S. was probably around $2,500. So $3,000 was not an insignificant amount of money. As a reparation, as an indemnification for the 500,000 Jewish refugees who survived the Holocaust and were moving to Germany. And there was a gigantic debate in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, between the government, which said we should take this money, it's a lot of money, we need the money, and the minority led by a guy named Menachem Begin, who would later become prime minister of Israel many, many years later. Begin said we shouldn't take a nickel from these people because it's blood money. And what they're giving us does not compensate, does not repair. They're buying their conscience off. We shouldn't take anything from them. Under Ronald Reagan, the United States government offered a reparation to people who had been interned in World War II who were Japanese Americans. And the reparation was $10,000 to every living Japanese American who had been in an internment camp. Now, how do you, to use your question, what could the economists do to determine what your time is worth if you spend 3 years in a Japanese American internment camp in Northern California, freezing your butt off in the winter and being hot as hell in the summer, and losing all your property that you had in California when they trucked you off to the camp? What's all that worth? It's got to be a lot more than $10,000. The $10,000 was not, in other words, a compensation, but rather was a reparation. And by the way, a number of Japanese Americans told the U.S. government to take their money and stick it somewhere, although they were probably more polite about it than I just was, because they said, you can't buy me off for $10,000. I'm not going to take it. So one of the questions that we have to come to terms with is the distinction between a compensation and a reparation. I think there was one more question, and then I'm going to move back to my talk.
Professor Rappaport?
Yeah, you just, since you mentioned Texas a couple of times, I just thought it would fit perhaps with what you were opening up with. And I wanted to point out that this is still a live issue in America. I was in Austin, Texas. I just got back, and there's probably you know it, there's a Confederate monument in front of the Capitol building in Austin. Mm-hmm. And I'll just read what the text on the front of it, there's other things on it, but the text on this Confederate monument says, "Died for states' rights guaranteed under the Constitution. The people of the South, animated by the spirit of 1776 to preserve their rights, withdrew from the federal compact in 1861. The North resorted to coercion. The South, against overwhelming numbers and resources, fought until exhausted." So that's the current view right there in front of the state capitol in Austin, Texas. And I don't think it's exceptional to Texas. I think that's a view that continues to exist in a fair number of places in this country.
I think everything you say is true. One of the differences is that in 1920 or 1930 or as late as 1950, a professor at the University of Texas could have gotten up and given that as a lecture to a history class. And today, that kind of analysis and that kind of argument would be laughed at and mocked. That doesn't mean that large numbers of people don't believe it and want to believe it. You know, I'm going to say one more thing about the comparison between the Civil War and Germany, and then I want to move on to something else. The first time I went to Germany, I was at an academic conference, and academic conferences in Germany are always funded by the government. And so there was, you know, the deputy third undersecretary of education or something was there, you know, some young political guy on his way up the ladder. And at one of the breaks, and the nice thing about their conferences is the breaks always have a good German white wine and beer. So, you know, the breaks are worth going to. At one of the breaks, he says to me, how are you liking Germany? And I said, I'm actually surprised. I'm enjoying myself. And he said, well, why are you surprised? And I said, well, because as an American Jew, Germany would not be the first place on my list of European countries to visit. He got very offended, very, very, dramatically offended. And he said, well, we are the only country in Europe that is officially denazified. Now, at the time, the Prime Minister of Austria was Kurt Waldheim, who had been a Nazi and who had hidden his past. And of course, we all made jokes about people get old, they get Waldheimer's disease, which is when you get so old you forget you were a Nazi war criminal. But the point of this German bureaucrat was actually important, because what we did after World War II was to denazify Germany. We re-educated Germany. We forced Germans to come to terms with their past. General Patton forced the people of Munich to go to Dachau and see what was there. Other US commanders did the same thing. They forced Germans to come to terms with their concentration camps. They forced Germans to come to terms with the horror that they had perpetrated on people. After the Civil War, as Reverend Thomas had me point out, this didn't happen in the South. There was no re-education. There was no forcing of Southerners to come face to face with the horror of slavery. Quite the opposite. You basically had a president who was saying, hey, you got to give up your slaves, but don't worry, everything else can be pretty much the same. So that's the post-war. Let me stop there, and I want to fast forward to World War I. Because at the end of World War I, the victorious Allies forced the country of Germany to pay large reparations to the European countries it had invaded. Germany had, after all, occupied 20-30% of France. The death toll in France was horrendous. Something like 1 out of every 18 people in France died. It wasn't 10% of the population, but it was a lot. It was a huge toll. It was a 4-year war. Areas of France were devastated. And the Germans were forced to pay reparations to France. And what that did was to impoverish Germany, to break it as an economy, and set the stage for Hitler. Because Hitler is able to rise to power in the 1920s. First, he tries a coup which fails, goes to jail for a while, comes out of jail, reorganizes his political party, and spends 8 years going from a convicted criminal to becoming Chancellor of Germany. And part of the impetus for voting for Hitler was the fact that the Allies had impoverished Germany during the war. And so after World War II, in Germany, the United States develops a very different policy. We have the Marshall Plan. We say we are not going to impoverish Germany. We are rather going to re-educate the German people. We are going to force them to understand their past. We're going to force them to learn what they did. But it's not going to cost them money. It's going to cost them psychic time. And so the other thing we did after World War II is we set up a tremendous number of exchange programs. So German high school students and German college students come to the United States in the 1940s or 50s. Again, the first time I went to Germany, one of my hosts was a German professor. He was about 15 years older than I was. And he had come to the United States in the early 1950s as a high school student. He loved America. And it was through this that Germany transformed itself from a country which had historically been anti-democratic, had historically always been a dictatorship. There's a wonderful title. One of the first really good books about the Weimar Republic was, the book was titled Germany Tried Democracy. And of course, the irony is that they failed at it. They failed at it in part because of the reparations. So after World War II, we did a very different kind of reconstruction of Germany. Sadly, we did not do this in Japan. We did not make the Japanese come to terms with their own past. So for instance, to this day, Japan refuses to acknowledge, to compensate the remaining survivors of 1.5 million, mostly Korean and Chinese women, who were forced to be called comfort women for the Japanese army and essentially forced into sexual slavery for the war. And Japan denies it happened. Said, no, this is all made up, because we did not force the Japanese to confront their past. But we did with the Germans, and it made a huge difference. Germany then, on its own, said we need to have a reparation for the destruction of the European Jewish community. Germany doesn't deny that 6 million Jews are murdered by the Germans. You know, people may argue, some people say it's only 5.7 million. That's a stupid argument. Whether it's 6 million or 6.1 or 5.8, there's no reason to get into that argument. The reality is that millions and millions of people were murdered, and that Germany, in fact, made murder of civilians a prime political policy, a prime social policy, a prime industrial policy. The German industries put in bids to build crematoria to burn bodies. Nothing was hidden about this. This was all out in the open. Everybody knew it. Germany said, we have to do something. So what does Germany do? Germany gives reparations as a kind of a block grant to various entities. So one of the block grants it gives is to the new country of Israel, which is absorbing 500,000 refugees from the Holocaust. It creates something called the Claims Conference, and the Claims Conference still exists. My college, in fact, just got a grant from the Claims Conference to. We have about 900 audio tapes of interviews with Holocaust survivors, and we just got a Claims Conference grant to begin to transcribe these so that they can be more easily used. Claims Conference is still out there, supporting ways in which you have a reparation for the Holocaust that is cultural, that is communitarian, but that is not individualized. In addition to that, and this is something important to understand. In addition to that, Germany has paid compensation, again, not reparation, but compensation to people who were in slave labor camps. So Germany said, if you were in a labor camp, you get a certain compensation. Germany has further paid a compensation, not a reparation, to Holocaust survivors for their losses. That is, for being forced to leave their country, being forced to abandon their property, being forced to abandon their family. But Germany has not done a reparation or a compensation for people who died, on the theory that you can't compensate the dead. You can compensate some family members, and certainly there have been claims that have been sometimes successful on the basis that I should be compensated because you killed my parents. But for example, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, which is known as the Claims Conference, increased its funding in 2018. They added another $88 million to the fund to continue to pay compensations. But compensations is different than a reparation. And so these are part of this is part of the complexity of this. When we talk about reparations in the United States, what are we talking about? Now, according to my clock, I got 3 minutes left. Let me see if I can just touch on one other topic, but I'm willing to stay a couple of minutes longer if there are other questions. I don't know whether Renee is going to allow me to do that or whether she will cut me off, but we'll see. I want you folks to get whatever it is that you can get from this. I want to give you another foreign reparations model. We are all familiar with South Africa. South Africa created after World War II, actually starting well before World War II, but after World War II completely, when the Nationalist Party, which was essentially a party dominated by people whose ancestry was from Holland as opposed to England, the National Party set up a system of apartheid, a very rigid system of segregation, also a very weird one because it was tripartite. So there were blacks, coloreds, and whites, and so the American South had two bathrooms, bathroom for blacks, bathrooms for whites. South Africa had three sets of bathrooms, three sets of drinking fountains, three sets of rules. And that was to create various kinds of racial separation. Coloreds had more rights than blacks. Blacks had the least rights. Whites had all the rights. And South Africa created a completely functional democracy as long as you were white. And South African whites had absolute free speech as long as you didn't talk about apartheid. So it was a very weird country. On one hand, the white people would say, hey, we have a democracy, we have political parties, we have debates. We can debate everything except the one thing that matters. That we can't debate, that we can't talk about. And it worked until finally it didn't work. Until finally the white South Africans woke up and decided we have to do something different. And they essentially ceded power to the overwhelming black majority. And Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. And Bishop Tutu was there to provide spiritual guidance. I mean, South Africa lucked out in an unbelievable way in having two very wise, very humane, very well-educated leaders of the black community to step in as apartheid came to an end. Now, if you were a black South African, you wanted revenge. The police had shot people. What happened to George Floyd happened with a regularity in South Africa that you couldn't even quantify. It happened all the time. Black people were shot, black people were beaten up, black people were killed. Nothing happened to the white police who did this. The white police targeted black leaders, kidnapped them, and they disappeared. They took other black leaders like Mandela and put him in jail for more than 20 years. So it would have been human. It would have been a human emotion. It would have been logical for black South Africans to say, we want revenge. We want to try all these white cops. We want to try them for murder. We want to try them for torturing black people. And we want to put them in jail and throw away the key. We want to put them in front of the wall and have a firing squad. And instead, they did something very unique. They had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in which they said that if people come forward and honestly say what they did, honestly talk about what happened, that they will be not face criminal sanctions, there will be instead a reconciliation, but it required an honesty to do so. That is a different model than a vengeance model or a reparations model or even a compensation model. Now, it was possible to do that as a national model because it was the whole country that was doing it, and it was the new government that was doing it. But let me stop there, and Linda Bauer has her hand up, so let me get your question, and then others.
Not so much a question as a comment. It was interesting. First of all, I think this has been very interesting. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and my mother worked in a munitions factory as slave labor. She was able to escape Auschwitz that way. She survived, my father survived, and the rest of my family was killed. So it was, I never thought before of what you said about some sort of reparation or compensation for all the people, all my family that died, but you can't replace them. That being said, my parents did receive reparations, and they got a regular check, I think, until they died. We came to America when I was 2. They got a regular check until they died a few years ago.
In 1988, Germany authorized a $290 a month payment for every survivor for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And I think there were possibilities of children of survivors like myself. The lawyers made a lot of money on this, by the way, because you had to go through an attorney to help you get the money. Okay, so that being said, what interests me about this reparations, compensation, whatever discussion is, how do you do it for slavery? Because my parents were directly affected. They were the ones who lost family. They were the ones who were in the concentration camps and so on. And it's going to be interesting to me to know how you do a reparation, or to whom you do a reparation for the slaves that were affected years ago. Is there some way we can do something for the the Black community to, can reparations create understanding and acceptance? It'd be great. A $200 check to a Black person, does that fix anything? I don't know, but certainly well, I don't know about me. I wasn't here for the slavery part, but certainly this country needs to do something to bring our people together, Black, white, Asian. It's terrible what's going on now. So, I mean,
Look,
the rest of the discussion.
Linda, everything you say focuses on the difficulty of the problem. I want to say one thing quickly, because not you, but other people will say, my family was not here when there was slavery. My family was in Poland or Italy or Russia or England or Ireland. My family did not own slaves. Why should we be, made to feel like we owe something to people? And I think the answer is very simple. When you move to a country, when you accept citizenship of a country, when you are born in a country, you accept the history of the country.
Yes, I agree.
You accept it. You accept everything that came. Those of you who have visited the White House, it's at least worth knowing that most of the laborers who built the White House were slaves. So if we enjoy the White House, if we enjoy the Congress, if we enjoy putting on horns and face paint and going bare-chested into Congress and trying to start a revolution in that building, we should at least know that that building was built with slave labor. And so you can't say, well, I wasn't here, it's not my problem.
No, and I wasn't.
And I'm not saying you are. No, I understand that.
How do we fix it?
Yeah, no, I understand that. I simply wanted to take your point and put it out there so everybody can think about it for a minute. Because I'm assuming that in some ways, most of the people who are at this event don't have to be convinced that we have a problem. I think you're here because you realize there's a problem. What I'm trying to do is suggest strategies, suggest knowledge, suggest arguments to take out to the larger world when it's discussed. So when somebody says, well, my family wasn't here, you can say, well, do you like the Statue of Liberty? Yeah, I love the statue. Well, your family wasn't here. You can't like the Statue of Liberty. It wasn't you where they weren't here when you were built. Your family wasn't here when Yellowstone Park was created as a national park, so you shouldn't be able to go to it. Obviously, we absorb everything as citizens, the good, the bad. We accept the history. It's part of who we are. I've got 2 more sessions where I will raise some of the questions that you're asking, because even if I get to go over by another 10 minutes, I can't even begin to talk about them. Are there any other questions that I should take before we go? I'm not seeing any hands come up. So Renee, I want to turn it back over for you, and you can.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Obviously, there is so much here, and I suspect there are lots of questions and lots of things that people would like to raise that we ran out of time for. We're just getting started, so I appreciate all of you who gave your time, and Dr. Finkelman for getting us started. Our next conversation is at the same time, at the same Zoom, the very same one you used on Sunday night, May 16th. Feel free to invite people privately and let people know about this. We're going to keep coming closer and closer to home. Our third conversation, we'll get to Evanston, which I think is the closest we've got here, and then bring it right in here to Champaign-Urbana. But we're going to go to some of the examples of U.S. reparations in our next session. So I encourage you to sort of look into that, and I look forward to our next session with Dr. Finkelman. I appreciate you being here. Yes.
Before you go, Mark just had his hand up, or was that not a hand raised?
I'm sorry, that was intended to be clapping hands.
Well, I will clap for you for being such a great interactive audience.
Yeah,
thank you. And again, if any of you want to communicate with me, I see there's some chat texts. I'm happy to communicate with any of you. I'm happy to send you further things to read, to talk about these things. We've touched on a lot of issues. So,
all right.
We'll see you again.
All right. Be well, everyone. To join our next conversation on Sunday, May 16th at 6:15 p.m. Central Time, please contact Pastor Renee on Facebook at New Covenant Fellowship CU, on the ncf-cu.com website, or faith leaders at the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation or the Interfaith Alliance. The podcast and video from that conversation will be posted when available. Thank you for joining us.